Alright, guys, today we'll be reading Plato's 5 dialogues. So, this particular version that we'll be going over will be the Jowlet or the Jolet, translation. So, starting off today, we'll be just covering the introduction. So, let's begin. Introduction. Some 2400 years ago, that part of the world which represented Western civilization was divided into two opposing leagues of states. One league was headed by a seagoing trading democracy, mistress of a marine empire of colonies and more or less subject states scattered through the neighboring seas. The other was led by an inland military aristocracy, conqueror of considerable territory close around itself and an ally of whatever states feared the spread of democratic imperialism. The democracy of Athens, then at the height of her expanding pride and glory. The aristocracy of Sparta, conservative and tenacious, holding on to all that has ever been hers. Athens had a matchless fleet, Sparta an army without equal on shore. The citizens of democratic Athens were proud of their liberty, their government by popular assemblies and officials chosen yearly by a combination of ballot and lot. Women, foreigners and slaves were of course excluded from politics, but the vote of every free-born Athenian man counted for as much as every other's. They were proud too in Athens of their unparalleled culture and their literature, drama, music and art. The beautiful new Parthenon, a temple of their patron goddess Athene, shone down on them from the Acropolis. In their theatres were produced tragedies and comedies that are still the marvels of the world. Among writers and intellectuals there is much free thought and speculation on questions of science, philosophy and religion. The city, however, was strict in performing its duties to the gods of the fathers, celebrating in special state the festivals of Athene, of the nature of god Dionysus, and the earth mother Demeter. Athenians revered and consulted the mysterious oracle of Apollo and its rocky ravine at Delphi, and competed in the Pan-Hellenic games at Olympia in honor of the great Zeus. In soldierly Sparta, life was far more austere, more like that of an armed garrison in a country of aliens. As hardened warriors, Spartans scorned the things that made men soft: wealth, trade, luxury, and refinements. They were proud of their physical strength, bravery, and discipline. In 431 BC, the long smoldering rivalry between the two leagues broke out in open war, where the problem was who was to control the sea routes to the west, that is to Sicily and South Italy. Until then, Sparta's ally Corinth had almost a monopoly of relations with the flourishing Greek settlements in that region. But now Athens wanted the trade in the western grain and metals for her empire. For 27 years, the so-called Peloponnesian War dragged on, with the advantage swinging first to one side, then to the other. By 404, Athens was exhausted, drained of men, resources, her harbour empty of ships, her empire shattered. For a few months she was compelled to submit to the government by a pro-Spartan aristocratic clique of her own citizens, the infamous 30. In their short term of office they did their best to liquidate all the leading democrats of the city, but that was more than defeated Athens could endure. At the end of the year, the people rose, drove out the 30, and set up the forms of democracy once more. But Athens had lost faith in her own powers, and the treacherous, cold-blooded behavior of her citizens had shaken her people's confidence in one another. Who was to be trusted when enemies ringed her around and her own turned and stabbed her? The city was split into factions, each hating the other more than they did the Spartans. For some time there had existed in Greece a class of professional teachers of citizenship to train young men in the art of politics, public speaking and debate. that they might know how to acquit themselves in the assemblies and courts on the commissions to which they might be appointed. These teachers, called sophists, among themselves they offered a good deal both as to method of teaching and as to the kind of moral intellectual standards they gave their pupils to follow. The more old-fashioned still kept their faith in the gods of Homer and the poets, and the codes of patriotism and fair dealing that had been accepted before the war. Others were advocates of new materialistic science that saw the universe as a product of whirling atoms and chance. They doubted whether there were gods who took any interest in men. Others, still more skeptical, denied that men could ever know anything certain about the world, or gods, or anything at all. Many of these went on to assert that right and wrong, justice and injustice, truth and falsehood, were merely artificial conventions, agreed on and upheld by human societies for their own convenience and forced upon them by superior might. Everyone could see that they differed from time to time and nation to nation. There were therefore no divine and unchangeable laws of right and wrong that remained right and wrong always and everywhere. The truth is, which is agreed upon at the time of agreement and as long as the agreement lasts. The one thing certain was that men by nature were greedy for pleasure, money, fame, and would always get what they could by fair means or foul. To the mass of plain Athenian teachings like these were horrifying and blasphemous. No wonder they thought the gods had ceased to defend a city that sheltered such wickedness and atheism in its walls. One man in particular, who had long been a conspicuous figure in the city life, their suspicion and anger suddenly fell. This man was Socrates, a stonecutter by trade, frequently called a sophist, though he protested he was not. He had no classroom, gave no formal instructions, and took no pay. He only walked about the places where Athenians congregated, the streets, the marketplace, and the gymnasium, or sat in the houses of acquaintances, talking cheerily to whoever stopped to listen. On the much discussed scientific problems of nature and origin of the universe, he had nothing to say. In that connection, the only question he had that interested him was why the universe was made as it was, and the question he had never found anyone able to answer. Why then waste time arguing over things that all wise men disagreed about, in search for knowledge that would do one no good if one had it? What men needed to know was how to make the best out of living. Socrates was one of those who Cicero said afterward brought philosophy down from heaven to earth. To the sophists and materialists who denied the existence of any absolute goodness and truth and ridiculed the old moralities and the old faith, he was utterly opposed. Yet neither would he return blindly and uncritically to the old ways simply because they were old. To believe a thing because one's grandfather believed it was no more right than to believe because a sophist preached it. The only way now to cure disillusionment, cynicism, and doubt, to which many Athenian disasters and sophistic reasoning had brought too many of the youth of the day to push reasoning further. The method he used to persuade people to do this has been a model for imitation ever since. Start with a simple question, suggested by something someone else has said. Ask him innocently to explain what he thinks is the meaning of some familiar word, the name of something, immaterial but regarded commonly as an important friendship, as important. For example, friendship, courage, justice, truth. Show him by more probing questions how stupid his conventional definition is, and kindle his interest to try for something better, something that will pierce down to the very heart of the problem of human values. Even if he reaches no positive conclusion, both he and the listening circle will have realized for a moment, at least, how foolishly they have taken for granted habits, opinions, and attitudes that were prejudiced, harmful, and false, and how thrilling and inspiring may be the hunt for honesty and truth. We shall be better, braver, and less helpless if we think we ought to inquire about such things than we should have been if we indulged in the idle fancy that there was no knowing and no use in trying to know. To Socrates, as he said at his trial, when the Athenians seemed to need most in these years of bitter discomfiture, was not Siren to flatter or soothe them with sham promises of speedy return to prosperity and grandeur, but a gadfly to sting them to unflinching self-examination, to see where in the past they had been wrong-headed and mistaken, and now how with patience and hard working they might yet build better lives for themselves and for their city. If only men could be brought to see the good, he was sure they would always choose it and understand, as he did, that to do evil was worse even than to suffer it. Men were bad because they were thoughtless and ignorant. Straight thinking must lead to right living. Socrates was no philosophical innovator with the disturbing new theories of gods. He believed that they were good and that they watched over and protected good men and women. He himself heard often a divine voice forbidding him to do things he should not do. He paid the usual offerings in the temples, but his manner of speaking of divine as well as other matters was unusual. His way of questioning popular ideas, old as well as new, seemed really just one more way of teaching the young to have no respect for their elders and to speculate about what their ancestors had accepted in reverence and trust. If he had only been willing to keep silence and stop his perpetual discussions that unsettled everybody's minds at this time of danger to the state, the jury would undoubtedly have let him go. But I shall not change my ways, he said, though I die 1,000 deaths. The jury thereupon condemned him to die. Like Jesus, Socrates left no written word behind him, but like him, he devoted followers who wrote their recollections of what he had said and done. Most of this early Socratic literature, like the primitive Christian documents, has disappeared. But one of those Socrates' disciples was the author of a series of dialogues that began as a monument to a beloved master, but went on to become the starting point of much that was to be fruitful and profound in European thought to this day. As one of our modern thinkers has remarked, philosophy ever since then has consisted largely of footnotes on Plato. Plato, 427 to 347, came of a distinguished Athenian family. In his youth, he tells us in a letter, he had looked forward eagerly to entering public life. He was 23 when the war ended with the overthrow of the discredited democratic government. Among the aristocratic 30 were his mother's brother and cousin. They invited Plato to join them. I thought, he says, these men were going to put a stop to the evils that had been happening and govern the city with justice. So I watched their conduct closely to see what they would do. But they soon showed me that their preceding regime had been a golden age by comparison. The worst weakness of democracy seemed nothing beside the savagery of the 30. When, however, the 30 expelled, Plato hoped for once more to take part in city politics. The restored democracy was at first surprisingly moderate and even generous in its treatment of those who had tried to destroy it. But ere long the young man's sensitive conscience was shocked again. His teacher Socrates, whom I would not hesitate to call the most righteous man of the time, was accused by influential Democrats of impiety and put to death. The more I reflected on what was going on and what kind of men were active in politics and what kind of laws and customs we had, and the older I grew, the more I realized how hard it is to reform public life. Grieving for Socrates and baffled in his hope of doing something with the Democrats to improve the state of things in Athens, he went abroad and stayed for over 10 years. In Sicily, he spent time at the court of Dionysius I of Syracuse, observing the working of a dictatorship. At last, he says, I came to the conclusion that all existing states are badly governed and the condition of their laws practically incurable without the application of drastic remedies and help of fortune, and that the ills of human race will never disappear until by God's gift those who are sincere and true and lovers of wisdom attain political power, or the rulers of our cities learn true philosophy. Some time after reaching this conclusion, Plato returned to Athens and founded his academy, since called the first European university of private estate outside the city walls. Not if he could would he start another violent revolution in government, had he seen enough of blood, slaughter, and exile. But after the manner of Socrates, he would serve the city by teaching young men the love of wisdom, truth, and silence, until reform came peacefully by education and persuasion. Like Socrates, he believed the virtue to be a form of knowledge that could be taught. But this program of teaching was more far-reaching and systematic than Socrates had been. It included preparatory studies in mathematics, astronomy, music, logic, as well as in politics and ethics. Only by strict discipline did he think a young mind be made to penetrate beyond this disorder welter present in our world and perceive the unchangeable principles of truth. Before long, the academy was drawing students from all over the Greek world. It continued to do so from some 900 years until the Christian Emperor Justinian had last closed the doors in 529 AD. The latter half of his life, Plato spent time teaching, lecturing, and writing at his school, except for 2 trips he made back to Syracuse. In 367, the second Dionysius succeeded his father. He had ambitions to be a great ruler, showed a hopeful interest in learning, and was susceptible to influence. There seemed a chance that under wise guidance he might become beneficial statesman that Plato was longing to see come to power somewhere. Plato paid him 2 visits, anxious now that opportunity seemed at hand to test his ideals in practice. But Dionysius was not, after all, the stuff of which philosopher rulers are made. He tired quickly of study, was easily excited to jealousy and suspicion. His word could not be relied on. Deeply disappointed, Plato came home to Athens. He died there at the age of 80. The wars between the Greek cities and parties were still going on, breaking down the strength and morale of all of them, regardless of the menace of rising new power in the north. 9 years after Plato's death, Greece found herself lying helpless before the armies of Philip of Macedonia, father of Alexander the Great. The day of the free Greek state was over. Plato left behind him a mass of writings which we possess several letters and at least 25 authentic dialogues. His own views as well as his master's were presented in the form of not imposing treatises or heavy textbooks, but of dramatic conversations between friends, fresh, spontaneous, humorous, and informal, held as a chance might have it in some house or public building or open space of Athens. I will pause here to opine that these men may have been the first podcasters. Plato, Socrates, and Socrates is, I suppose, the first batch that he taught could very well be the foremost podcasters of their time, and these written documents are a version of what podcasts are today. Anyway, continuing. Where Socrates had been known to talk in all but the latest dialogues, Socrates figures as the presiding genius and chief speaker. Even when his time goes on, the ideas he is expressing are no longer but his disciples. Plato in his own person never said a word. Taken together, However, these dialogues contain his answers to the three fundamental questions that had been raised by his predecessors and contemporaries. First, where can a man find anything which he can know is truth? Second, what are the origin and constitution of the natural world in which man is set? Third, for what purpose was man created and what should he choose as his aim in life? To put in simple words, Plato's solution of the problem of how we discover knowledge is true may be summarized as follows. Our senses, sight, touch, hearing, often deceive us. Our sense impressions taken alone are misleading and superficial and tell us nothing about the real nature of things around us. Common opinion, grounded as it is on sensation, hearsay, and habit, cannot be trusted as a guide to truth. But through our reason, we may arrive at what may be rightfully called true knowledge and understanding. Through reason, we may use our sense experiences and memories of past experiences material for a process of analysis, classification, synthesis that bit by bit builds up for us a pattern of permanent invisible order behind the perplexing panorama, which is all that our senses alone perceive. So for today, this will be the end of the introduction. Do let us know in the comments what you thought. Give us your opinions and we shall get back to you. I understand, there is a lot that can be improved upon. However, I am not going to continue today because my throat is not so well and my cough is getting worse. I've had to pause the recording several times now to correct myself and to come to a position where I can continue reading. Hence, I will postpone this for a future date. Thank you for listening, and if you liked the video, please drop a like and subscribe and hit the bell notification if you would like to catch our subsequent uploads. Thank you and have a great day. Pax Vobiscum.